The veil slipped over her face, and the world turned into shadows. The dress was too heavy for her small frame. The hem dragged like a chain across the stone floor. The sleeves swallowed her arms whole, like she was drowning in silk she didn't choose. She was 11, still chasing butterflies in the garden, still tracing shapes in the dust with her bare feet, still whispering secrets to the ragged doll she hid under her pillow. But that day, they called her a wife. The bells rang like a celebration, but to her they sounded like a funeral. The guests smiled, clapped, murmured blessings, as if they weren't watching a child walk into a cage. The man beside her gripped her hand too tightly. His fingers pressed until her knuckles turned white. He was old enough to be her father, but in their eyes, that didn't matter. She didn't cry, not because she didn't want to, but because they had warned her. Good wives do not cry. Good wives do not resist. Good wives stay silent. And so, she stood there, a trembling child hidden behind lace, the weight of eyes pressing down heavier than the crown she'd never wear. The priest muttered his words. Her parents looked proud. The crowd cheered, and when the door closed behind her, her childhood closed with it. She was a bride before she knew how to braid her own hair. History erased her name, but not her story, not her silence, and not her power, because this is where her voice begins, forgotten in the books, but remembered here. Now. The first morning after her wedding, they dressed her in silk, not because it suited her, but because it suited him. Her hair was combed until her scalp burned. Her wrists were weighed down with bangles that clinked with every movement, and when she dared to look in the mirror, she did not see herself. She saw a stranger wrapped in obedience. She was 11, her hands still clumsy, her laughter still childish. But laughter was no longer allowed. Not here. Not in this house. The rules were whispered to her quickly, like instructions for a prisoner entering a cell. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not eat until he lifts his fork. Do not leave your chambers without permission. Do not smile too brightly. Do not cry where anyone can see. Each rule was a chain, each chain invisible, but heavy. Her husband, 20 years her senior, a man of ambition, sharp eyes, sharper tongue. To the world, he was powerful. To her, he was terrifying. His voice could slice through silence like a blade. His hands lingered too long, too heavy, too certain. When he entered the room, she shrank. When he left, she exhaled. But she learned quickly. Fear alone would not save her. She began to watch every face, every gesture. The way the steward bowed deeper when coin was mentioned. The way the cook's hands trembled when the master's footsteps echoed down the hall. The way servants carried gossip in lowered voices, believing she was too young to understand. But she listened, always listening. Because when you are forbidden to speak, you learn the language of silence. She noticed how her husband's smile widened when people flattered him, how his jaw tightened when someone disagreed. She noticed which guests left wine in their cups and which drained them nervously. She noticed the way maids avoided her eyes, not out of respect but out of pity. And slowly, she began to understand. Power wasn't only in words, it lived in pauses, in glances, in secrets whispered when people thought no one was listening. Still, she was a child. Her feet ached from standing too long. Her head spun from dinners where she didn't understand half the words spoken. She longed to run barefoot through grass, to giggle without consequence, to hold her doll again without shame. But innocence had no place here. Every smile she forced, every silence she swallowed, was a step away from the girl she had been, and a step closer to the woman they demanded she become. At night, lying in a bed too large for her body, she whispered stories into the dark. Not to comfort herself, but to remind herself she still existed. That behind the silks and the silence there was still a girl who wanted to ask questions, a girl who wanted to run, a girl who did not yet know that survival in this house would not come from defiance. It would come from learning, from watching, from turning silence into a shield. And as the days became months, and the months began to stretch into years, she started to master it. Her husband thought she was obedient. Her parents thought she was safe. The court thought she was invisible, but she was studying them all. Every look, every whisper, every weakness. She'd been forced into a cage at 11. But even in cages, birds learn how to watch. And sometimes, watching is the first step to flying. The news came quietly, as death often does. Her husband was gone. Some said fever, others whispered poison. A few muttered he had fallen in battle. The truth. No one dared to speak aloud. She was 15, a widow before she was even a woman. The court murmured in pity, "She is too young. She will remarry. She will vanish into another man's shadow." That was the expectation, that she would return to her family or be sold into another marriage, another cage, another silence. But she did not vanish. Behind lowered lashes, behind soft nods of grief, she was calculating. For 4 years she'd been trained to watch, to listen, to understand power without ever touching it. And now, the seat beside her was empty, the chain was broken, and though she mourned aloud inside, she began to build. The estates were hers now, at least in name. Servants came to her for decisions, merchants awaited her approval, priests bowed politely, underestimating her, believing she was fragile, believing her tears made her weak. But her grief was not weakness, it was cover. Every condolence offered at the funeral became a promise remembered. Every noble who leaned close to whisper a kind word revealed a secret in their breath. Every priest who prayed too loudly betrayed what weighed on his conscience. She recorded it all, not on paper, in memory. Her mind became her ledger, her silence, her weapon. The council suggested she remarry quickly. She lowered her eyes and agreed softly. But weeks passed, months. Suitors came and went and she remained unclaimed. Whispers began. She is stalling. She is dangerous. She's not grieving as she should. They were right. At 15, she had already seen what most women never live long enough to understand. That power did not always sit on thrones. Sometimes it stood in corners, listening. She began inviting widows to her table, not for comfort, but for knowledge. She asked careful questions, hid sharper ones in polite smiles. They thought she wanted guidance. In truth, she was collecting maps of survival. Every meal became a lesson. Every silence became a strategy. The girl who had once obeyed was now being obeyed. When disputes arose in her lands, she was asked to mediate. When servants quarrelled, they sought her judgment. When letters arrived from noble families, they carried her name in the greetings. Slowly, without declaration, without title, she positioned herself as indispensable. She was no longer the child bride, no longer the trembling girl behind lace. She was the silent widow, and in her silence, a kingdom was beginning to shift. Because while men fought battles with swords, she was learning how to fight with something far sharper: memory, observation, and the patience to wait until the world forgot she was only 15. It began with whispers, not hers, but theirs. Men who once ignored her now leaned too close at dinners. Nobles who once saw a child now confided in a widow. Priests who once blessed her now sought her blessing in return. And she listened. Every favour promised, every debt owed, every weakness revealed in passing, she memorised. She carried no scrolls, no records. Her mind was her ledger, her silence, her ink. A duke confessed his coffers were nearly empty. She stored it away. A bishop admitted his fasts were broken with wine. She smiled and remembered. A knight boasted of victories that sounded a little too rehearsed. She nodded and filed it under lies. Piece by piece she built a map of the court. Not its lands, but its fears. And when the moment came, she used it. Never loudly, never directly. Always softly. Always as if it were nothing. A quiet word as a corridor. A suggestion whispered beneath her veil. A glance at the right time to the right person. And soon. Her words returned to her, not as hers, but as theirs. A lord stood in council, repeating her advice as if it had been his idea. A bishop declared a decision she had whispered weeks before. A knight gave orders shaped by her questions, never realizing the hand behind them. She did not argue. She did not claim. She let them believe. Because power is sharpest when invisible. The court said, she is just a widow. She is harmless. She is obedient. And while they dismissed her, they began to rely on her. The steward came to her when accounts tangled. The guards asked her whom to trust at the gates. Even her rivals, those who rolled their eyes at her silence, could not deny the way her absence left rooms unsteady. She had become a keeper of secrets, a confessor without a cross, a mirror no one realized they were staring into. And secrets, she discovered, were heavier than crowns, heavier and far more useful. One word placed carefully could make a man doubt his closest ally. One silence, stretched too long, could make a rival betray himself. She played carefully, never too bold, never too visible, always just enough. Her smile was mistaken for obedience, her stillness for grief, her silence for emptiness. But beneath it, she was weaving threads, tying knots no one could see until they were bound by them. The court changed slowly. At dinners, conversations tilted when she entered. Men who once mocked her lowered their voices. Women who once pitied her leaned closer, eager to be included. And the guards, the same men who once looked past her, now straightened when she walked by. Not from duty, but from caution. Because by now they had heard the stories. The noble who laughed too freely in her presence. Gone, exiled to distant lands. The steward who questioned her influence. Dismissed quietly without ceremony. The priest who married her off at 11. Found dead in his chambers, cause unknown. Coincidence, they said. Accident, they whispered. But no one truly believed it. And so they watched her differently, with calculation, with unease, with the fear that they too might vanish. She never raised her voice. She never claimed her hand. She never demanded recognition. She didn't need to. Because now, when she entered a room, men fell silent, women straightened, and the council shifted uneasily, knowing that beneath her stillness was the hand that guided them all. She was no longer just a widow. She was power in the shadows, the unseen architect of a kingdom, and the most dangerous thing about her was that no one realized it until it was already too late. It began with a whisper, and ended with a rebellion that never was. The lords had been plotting, hidden meetings, shadows in corridors, letters carried by trembling hands, but she already knew. She had listened when a servant muttered carelessly. She had noticed the missing seal on a letter. She had watched the way one noble's hand shook whenever the king's name was spoken. And when the time was right, she let it slip, not loudly, not publicly, just a quiet word, to the right ear. By dawn, the conspirators were arrested, their rebellion strangled before it could breathe, and the widow sat silently at the edge of council, her face unreadable. No one accused her, no one dared. But everyone noticed that she had been there, listening. After that, the council changed. When a new steward was needed, it was her suggestion that shaped the choice. When a marriage was to be arranged, it was her soft remark that decided which alliance would bind the families, always framed as a thought, a whisper, a harmless observation. But each suggestion shifted the kingdom's balance until the balance was hers. Her rivals began to notice, and those who noticed too loudly fell. One was accused of treason after a document appeared from nowhere. Another was caught in scandal, his secrets spilled like wine across the floor. A third vanished entirely. Exile, they said. Illness, they claimed. But no one asked too many questions, because by now they had learned, when men stood against her, they did not stand for long. The court began to build her legend, not in official decrees, but in whispers behind closed doors. They said she knew every secret. They said she could end a man with a single silence. They said even the king listened when she raised her eyes, and the rumours grew darker. Some swore she had poisoned her husband years ago, that his sudden death had been no accident. Others insisted she orchestrated the disappearances, pulling strings no one else could see. There were tales that her prayers were curses, that her letters carried more weight than royal seals, that she could destroy a man without ever raising her voice. None of it was proven. None of it could be. And that was what made it terrifying. She never confirmed. She never denied. She simply smiled softly and the room grew colder. The courtiers gave her titles in secret. The Widow of Shadows, the Silent Hand, the court's most dangerous woman. And she wore those titles like armour, not openly, not proudly, but quietly, as though they were crowns no one dared to place on her head. By now, men who once dismissed her as harmless, avoided her gaze, women who once pitied her, now sought her protection. Even guards, those hardened men with swords and scars, bowed deeper than necessary when she passed, because the truth was clear, though no one said it aloud. She had no throne, no crown, no army, and yet she ruled them all, not through force, not through fear alone, but through something sharper, something quieter, secrets, timing, and the patience to strike without ever being seen. The child who had been married at 11, the widow left behind at 15, was now the shadow every noble feared. She'd become the court's most dangerous woman, and the most chilling part was that her silence spoke louder than any king's decree. She had once been a child, forced into silence. Silence that came with bruises, with locked doors, with warnings whispered through clenched teeth. At 11, silence was survival. At 12, silence was punishment. At 13, silence was the ghost of who she had been. But now, that same silence had become something else. A weapon, a strategy, a crown invisible yet undeniable. She no longer dressed in gold-threaded gowns. Her dresses were plain, her jewellery minimal. A ring with no inscription, a string of pearls without glitter. Because she did not need decoration. She did not need to prove herself. Her power was not on her skin. It was in the air when she entered a room. In council, she rarely spoke. Sometimes hours passed without a single word from her lips. But when she did speak, the room shifted. Quills paused mid-scratch. Men who had been shouting lowered their voices, and decisions bent quietly toward her will. They feared her, not for what she said, but for what she chose not to, because silence leaves room for imagination, and imagination creates fear sharper than truth. Every noble carried secrets, and every noble wondered which of theirs she knew, what she might reveal, what she might already be using. She never confirmed, she never denied. She simply listened and let their doubts unravel them. The girl who once shrank at the sound of footsteps now made grown men stumble over their words. The child who once flinched at raised hands now raised no hand at all and still commanded obedience. Her transformation was not sudden. It was forged piece by piece, out of humiliation, out of loss, out of silence, beaten into her until it became second nature. But what had once been forced upon her was now hers to wield, and it terrified them, because she was not loud, she was not flamboyant, she was not reckless, she was precise, measured, unshakable. A woman who could sit in the corner of a chamber, say nothing, and still dominate the room. They called kings powerful, but kings had armies, she had none. Kings had crowns, she wore none. Kings demanded obedience, she received it without asking. Her power was subtler, stronger, more permanent, because it was not built on force, it was built on control. Control of secrets, control of silences, control of how others feared her, more for what she left unsaid than for what she spoke. She'd once been a victim, now she was the architect. The kingdom still called her widow, but in truth, she was something far greater, a presence, a shadow, a reminder that silence, when wielded with precision, can rule louder than any voice. They remembered her as the girl who controlled a kingdom without ever wearing a crown, a widow who silenced rebellions, a woman who bent nobles to her will, the shadow behind every decision, the whisper no one dared ignore. History painted her as a legend, the court's most dangerous woman, the silent hand that ruled them all. But peel back the myth, and what do you find? A childhood stolen, an innocence buried before it had a chance to bloom. A girl who once dreamed of running barefoot through grass, traded for silks and silence, even at her height with power trembling at her fingertips. She never truly escaped the cage, she only remade it, turned its bars into a throne, turned her silence into a crown. And though she ruled others, she never ruled herself, because power comes with a cost. It demands sacrifice. It devours freedom. It erases the laughter of children and replaces it with the weight of secrets. They said she won. They said she conquered. They said she became inevitable. But the truth is simpler and far sadder. She won power, but never innocence. She ruled a kingdom, but never herself.